Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime or creepy history topics each week. Last week we talked about Gilbert Paul Jordan, otherwise known as the Boozing Barber, or a man who got just way too many chances. If you're interested in that story, I will make sure to have it linked up here in the card for you. And if you're just interested in true crime or the macabre in general and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Just a heads up, today's story does go into the medical detail regarding the death of a child, and it also briefly covers themes of sexual abuse. So if that is not something that you're in the headspace to hear about right now, I completely understand and I urge you to click off of this video. It's important to me that you guys do what is best for you. I'm sure I'll catch you back here for a different one very soon. Today, we're going to be talking about Lacey Spears. Ever heard of her? Well, if you haven't, she's about to be the third inductee into the Worst Moms Club here on my channel because, wow. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's start at the beginning. Lacey Elizabeth Spears was born on October 16th, 1987 at Castle Air Force Base in Atwater, California, to her parents Terry and Tina Spears. She was one of 3 children in the Spears family with an older sister named Rebecca and an older brother named Daniel. Shortly after Lacey was born, Castle Air Force Base closed, so Terry quit his job and he and Tina packed up their family and moved across the country to Alabama to live in a house that was owned by Tina's parents. Their new home was located in Decatur, Alabama, which lies right in the heart of the Bible Belt. It has a population of less than 55,000 and a church on basically every street corner. Once they'd settled in, Terry took a job as a welder to support the family while Tina stayed home with their 3 children. Growing up, Lacey was not exceptionally close with either of her parents. A family member once stated on record that Lacey was always, quote, at odds with her father, and that Tina was a cold and unaffectionate mother. And starting at a young age, Lacey felt as though her parents were just too wrapped up within themselves to pay her adequate attention. Both Tina and Terry suffered from chronic illnesses, which took up a lot of their mental and physical energy. Tina had type 1 diabetes, and Terry had Crohn's disease and celiac disease. They were in and out of doctor's offices and medical appointments throughout most of Lacey's childhood. And based on statements that she'd make later in life, Lacey really seems to have taken this personally. But despite her home life, Lacey always came across as a relatively happy child. She was often referred to as outgoing and playful and is really remembered for her love of being the center of attention. A theme that will carry heavily throughout the rest of the story. Another thing that comes up when researching Lacey is how from a very early age she was obsessed with playing with dolls. She would wash her dolls, dress her dolls, and basically pretend that they were her children. And while this seems fairly normal, we all know that things in these stories are not always as they seem, and Lacey's story is no exception. When Lacey was in kindergarten, she met and befriended a girl named Mallory McWhorter, and the two were pretty much instantly inseparable. That is, until one very specific playdate at Lacey's house. Now, this wasn't the first invitation or first play date between the two by any means. Lacey had been to Mallory's house on numerous occasions, but Mallory had never been allowed at Lacey's house. Her mother just always had a funny feeling about the Spears family. But for some reason this time, Mallory's mother conceded. She went against her better judgment and allowed her daughter to go. At first, it was fine. The girls were just playing and everything seemed to be going well. But then Mallory reached for one of Lacey's dolls, and before she could even process what was happening, Lacey tightly wrapped her hands around her throat and began choking her. Mallory was able to free herself from Lacey's grip, but she was left incredibly confused with a large bruise around her neck. A bruise that shocked and appalled her mother when she showed up to pick her up. Mallory tried to calm her down by saying that everything was fine and that they'd just been playing, but her mother was not hearing it. She took it as confirmation that something was indeed up with the Spears family and vowed to never let her daughter around Lacey ever again. A fact that honestly didn't bother Lacey as much as one might imagine. She was outgoing and good at making friends, and relatively quickly, she had a new bestie. A girl named Jessica. Great name. Lacey met Jessica Kyle in 3rd grade, and ironically, the two actually did not get along when they first met. Actually, I feel like this is kind of a best friend cliche. I know so many best friends that are like, oh yeah, when I first met her, couldn't stand the bitch, and now I love her. And that's exactly how Jessica and Lacey's friendship began. They first met at recess in 3rd grade, where they got into a pretty heated debate over the monkey bars. Lacey wouldn't let Jessica on them, so Jessica spit on Lacey's glasses, and they began arguing until a teacher came over and forced them to each apologize, shake hands, and make up. And after this, The two were inseparable. In 1998, Lacey started junior high at Brookhaven Middle School, where she proved to be an excellent student. She was very eager to learn and did everything she could to please her teachers. She was relatively popular, she did well in school, and as far as anyone could tell, things were going pretty well for her. So Jessica's mom, Lisa Kyle, was shocked when Lacey showed up at her house one night, claiming that she was being molested by a relative and was too afraid to go home. Lisa called and reported the abuse to the Alabama Department of Human Resources, and she was actually given permission to keep Lacey in her home pending further investigation. However, from what I could find, there really wasn't much of an investigation conducted at all. But for the time being, Lacey loved this arrangement. She was happy staying with the Kyles. Within a week, she actually started calling Lisa Kyle Mom, which made her really uncomfortable, but given the circumstances, she felt awful for Lacey, so she didn't say anything. Now, I would never discount someone's claims of abuse. Ever. However, a direct quote from Lacey's sister Rebecca regarding this alleged abuse is, quote, "We had a happy childhood. As far as I know, it's not true. I don't know why people would say or think that, in all honesty," unquote. Again, I am not saying that she fabricated or embellished these claims. I could never know that for certain. What I do know is that over the following years, Lacey became known for concocting exaggerated stories and saying anything that she could just to shock people. But we'll get into more specifics on that shortly. When Lacey was 14, she became heavily involved with the local Parkview Baptist Church. She joined the student ministry, she joined their softball team, and eventually she even volunteered in their nursery. But it was while playing for the softball team that Lacey met and befriended 47-year-old Paula Sandlin. Despite the age gap, the two got along fairly well, and Paula eventually started driving Lacey to and from their softball practices and games. Things didn't get weird for Paula until Lacey randomly started calling her mom, just as she'd done years before with Lisa Kyle. And slowly, Paula started to realize that Lacey would either dramatize or just flat out make up stories just to garner attention. Years later, she'd go on record stating, quote, "If she didn't get a certain reaction, she would move to a bigger lie," unquote. She just really seemed to desperately crave attention from anyone and everyone she could possibly get it from. Over the years, she was caught in lies involving injuries, eating disorders, pregnancies, and even abortions. As her peers started catching her in more and more lies, Lacey's popularity kind of started to fade, but she honestly didn't care. She didn't enjoy socializing with kids her age and much preferred the attention and acceptance of the adults in her life. Throughout high school, Lacey continued to excel academically. She always turned her assignments in on time, and she took on an impressive array of extracurricular activities. And although she wasn't like queen of the school or anything, she wasn't a complete and total outcast either. She had a couple of close friends who really seemed to enjoy her company. They remember her fondly, speaking in interviews about how, despite being a determined perfectionist, Lacey was also a really cool girl. After Lacey graduated from Decatur High School in 2006, she moved in with her sister Rebecca and got a job working at a local daycare. Seeing as how she'd always loved children, this job was a perfect fit for her. She was extremely dedicated to not just the job, but the children. She was often one of the first people to show up for the day and one of the last people to leave. This drive was noticed and appreciated by Lacey's superiors, which prompted them to quickly promote her to a key holder's position. But eventually, Lacey started to take her role at the daycare too far. She would offer to take the children home with her so their parents wouldn't have to rush to pick them up on time, and she even began posting photos of some of the children to her own private social media. On top of that, she was also caught on multiple occasions pretending to be the mother of children she babysat independently outside of the daycare. Understandably, when the actual mothers found out that Lacey had been doing this, they were less than pleased. And wow, I don't know how many hours in a day Lacey actually had, because on top of working in the daycare and babysitting in her free time away from the daycare, Lacey also enrolled in community college to become a pediatric nurse, and she started casually dating a police officer named Blake, who she met through some mutual friends at church. So apparently all those mugs and t-shirts and things should say you have the same amount of hours in a day as Lacey Spears, because that broad was getting shit done. Lacey's relationship with Blake was short-lived, though. The two of them only went on about 3 dates before Blake called it quits. He just didn't feel that spark. Not that this stopped Lacey's imaginary relationship with him. Despite their relationship being very much over, Lacey began telling her friends and family that they were engaged. Unfortunately, the fake wedding with her imaginary fiancé never came around. Weird. So she moved on to seeing a man named Chris Hill, whom she'd met in her apartment building. But this relationship, if you can even call it that, was not serious at all. Chris referred to their arrangement as neighbors with benefits. But then she got pregnant. And despite the extremely casual nature of their relationship up to this point, Chris offered to marry Lacey, or at the very least become a serious boyfriend to her, because it was important to him that his child have a legitimate and stable home life. And at first, Lacey seemed on board with the idea of the two settling down and becoming a family unit once their son arrived. That is, until Chris told Lacey he didn't like the name she'd picked out for their baby. After that, she almost immediately flipped a switch and became adamant that Chris wasn't even the father of her child. Instead, she began telling everyone that the baby was actually her ex-fake fiancé Blake's child, even though this man was not involved in her life at all at this point. Obviously, Lacey never made any attempts to contact this man or have him be involved in her or her soon-to-be baby's life. So, on December 3rd, 2008, Lacey took on the role of single mother when her son Garnett Paul Thompson Spears was born. Garnett was a beautiful, perfectly healthy baby boy, and Lacey was thrilled. However, her excitement was not so much rooted in the birth of her healthy new baby, but by the social media attention that her new son seemed to garner her. This shouldn't be a shocking concept. People accuse content creators of this even now, of capitalizing on pregnancy or their children for social media content, so maybe they should thank Lacey Spears. Maybe she was the pioneer for that whole movement. She blasted photos of Garnett all over her MySpace, day in and day out. Then she'd sit back, relax, and relish in every single like, comment, or infinitesimal speck of attention she seemed to get. God, remember MySpace? Oh man, what a time to be alive, right? Anyways, sadly for Garnett, it didn't take long before his mere existence was not enough for Lacey any longer. She needed more, and she was gonna get it any way that she could. When Garnett was just 4 days old, Lacey rushed him to the hospital, insisting that he was really sick. She claimed that he had a dangerously high fever, a severe ear infection, and that he was looking jaundiced. Obviously, the doctors took her claims very seriously at first, but when they were able to thoroughly examine him, they determined that he was still a perfectly happy, healthy little boy, just as he'd been when he was discharged from the hospital days before. So Lacey and Garnett were sent home, but they would return to the hospital weeks later, with Lacey giving medical staff a very similar story. Again, the doctors thoroughly examined Garnett, and again, they determined that he was perfectly healthy, and again, they were sent home. And from this point on, this song and dance became Lacey's new favorite hobby. She and Garnett became frequent flyers at every doctor's office, urgent care, and hospital within her area. But no matter how many times she showed up to these places, she still felt as though her and her son were not getting adequate attention. So she began using each trip as social media content. She'd post photos of Garnett in hospital beds with IVs and complete them with just long rambling captions about how worried she was for her sick son. And just as she'd hoped, people flooded these posts with comments and attention and promises of their prayers. It seemed as though Lacey had finally found a way to get the attention that she'd craved all her life. Unfortunately, it just so happened that the price was her son's well-being. Lacey drugged Garnett to so many medical appointments and emergency rooms that by the time he was just 6 weeks old, his pediatrician actually began to suspect that Lacey was showing textbook signs of Munchausen's by proxy. I think since the whole Gypsy Rose Blanchard case exploded, most people are likely familiar with Munchausen's by proxy, but just in case, Munchausen's by proxy is a mental illness that results in a form of abuse. It's where a person pretends that someone who is dependent on them is suffering from a severe illness. And in serious cases, the person who is suffering with the mental illness, in this case Lacey, will do what they can to actually cause health problems. People with Munchausen's by proxy will do whatever it takes to get the attention and sympathy that's typically given to people who are actually sick and their families. Even allowing the patient, in this case Garnett, to undergo painful or risky tests and operations just to further their narrative. This is not to be confused with Munchausen syndrome, which is a mental health disorder in which a person falsifies, exaggerates, or induces their own physical, emotional, or cognitive disorders. So basically, Garnett's pediatrician was seeing right through all of Lacey's bullshit, and he reported her to social services. She was required to participate in a brief interview regarding the claim, which she did. However, she dodged the required home visit from social services for so long that her case was closed. So someone really dropped that that ball, and Lacey was free to carry on with her charade. She started traveling further and further distances to new hospitals and doctors' offices to avoid raising any further suspicion, which is something that is commonly done by people suffering with Munchausen's or Munchausen's by proxy. Once one doctor starts wising up to your antics, you simply bounce across town and start seeing a new one. But doctors always seem to become suspicious of Lacey. Where a normal person would bring their child in and say, "Here's a list of symptoms, please tell me what's wrong," Lacey always seemed to show up with her own diagnosis of Garnet, like she'd researched and pre-planned it at home. Her newest complaint and diagnosis being that no matter what she did, she could not get Garnet to keep anything down, therefore he must have acid reflux. And after a few tries, she did find a doctor that was willing to operate on Garnet to address the issue. This poor baby was completely and totally healthy, something some people would do anything for. But this was not good enough for Lacey. So now, at just 6 weeks old, she has her son undergoing a surgery that she knows damn good and well he doesn't need. All so she can get some attention on MySpace. Ugh. The only love and affection she would ever show her baby was performative and through a computer screen. At just 9 weeks old, based off of the information that Lacey provided to a gastroenterologist, Garnet was diagnosed with failure to thrive and again with acid reflux. And this diagnosis paved the way for Garnet's second surgery, a surgery with the sole objective of preventing Garnet from being able to throw up. After this surgery, Lacey again returned to the hospital, now claiming that Garnet was refusing his bottle. And when hospital staff attempted to feed Garnet with the bottle Lacey provided them, they couldn't get him to eat either. So he left this visit with a nasogastric feeding tube. And once the tube was removed, Lacey again returned to the hospital, claiming that Garnet still would not take a bottle. However, this time the hospital staff was able to get Garnet to eat the bottle Lacey provided. And once he did, they noticed an immediate change in his demeanor. And when the nurse questioned Lacey about the formula in the bottle, her explanation was that it was just likely improper. Unsure of what was actually going on with Garnet, doctors ordered some additional testing, and they found out that he had extremely high sodium levels. He started having seizures, and he stopped breathing and had to be intubated. And while all this was happening, Lacey was frantic. Not about Garnet's condition, though. Rather, about how fast she could get all of these updates posted to her makeshift mommy blog. Her 2-month-old baby was dehydrated, his body was in shock, and all she cared about was corresponding with her MySpace friends. Thankfully, doctors were able to stabilize Garnet, and although they didn't have any real medical explanation for his sodium levels or his refusal to eat, he was sent home. Over the next few months, Garnet was hospitalized for a multitude of feeding issues, ear infections, and whatever other miscellaneous complaints Lacey could think of. At this point, almost every doctor they saw believed that Lacey was at fault for Garnet's issues. But because they had no, concrete proof, they never reported her. At just 4 months old, Garnet had a surgery to repair perforated eardrums in both ears, which, given what we know now, we can almost guarantee Lacey is responsible for, which is just horrifying to think about. The things that she probably did to this poor little baby just to keep her demented story going is just gut-wrenching. And despite this surgery, Garnet was still in constant pain and suffered from back-to-back ear infections. So Lacey continued to bring Garnet to the hospital or to the doctor at any chance she got. And eventually, when he was about 10 months old, she started requesting that a feeding tube be inserted into his stomach. Although it took her a few tries, she was eventually able to find a doctor who agreed, and the procedure was performed. Obviously, she documented the whole process and plastered it all over the internet for her followers. And this just went on and on and on. By the time Garnet was 1, he had been to the hospital over 20 times, more times than probably most of us have by our adulthood. Despite all the attention that she was receiving on her MySpace as well as her new Facebook and Twitter, Lacey just continued to crave more and more. So she began bringing Garnet around to local churches, hoping for sympathy, food, clothing, diapers, money. She just couldn't get enough. And when Lacey felt she'd exhausted every church and doctor's office in Alabama, she packed up and moved to Florida, where she began experimenting with a more holistic approach to caring for Garnet. She restricted him to a vegan diet, and she started him on a regimen of herbs and supplements. Changes she heavily documented on social media or attention. But these posts actually seemed to attract more backlash than anything. People were concerned that Garnett wasn't being properly nourished, and Lacey was actually reported to Child Protective Services. Just like before, she was required to sit down for a formal interview, where she was actually advised to return her son to a more conventional diet. However, the case against her was ultimately dropped when it was determined that the person who'd made the complaint didn't actually know Lacey or Garnett outside of Facebook. The amount of times that this child could have been saved, but wasn't, is just shocking. In late 2012, Lacey followed her holistic dreams all the way to Green Meadow Waldorf School in New York. She was drawn to this secluded fellowship community after researching their live-off-the-land style philosophy. It's reported that Garnett was doing really well when they first arrived in New York, that he was outgoing and seemed to really enjoy his new environment. He was running around and playing and socializing and acting like basically just any other kid. But sadly, it wouldn't last. Almost as soon as she'd fully settled in, Lacey began, once again, making frequent trips to doctor's offices, urgent cares, and hospitals with her son. And she continued this until just after Garnett's 5th birthday. That's when Lacey finally took her act to the point of no return. On January 17th, 2014, Lacey rushed Garnett to the hospital, claiming that he'd suffered from multiple seizures that day and that he was just getting worse and worse by the minute. Multiple doctors worked on Garnett's case due to the confusing nature of how he presented versus the claims that Lacey was making. Eventually, one of the doctors even flat out stated that he thought that Lacey was the one who was sick, not Garnett. He wholeheartedly believed that Lacey was showing obvious signs of Munchausen's by proxy. But despite this concern, Lacey was not restricted from her son and instead lay in his hospital bed next to him, Googling things like salt poisoning, sodium levels in children, dangers of high sodium, and effects of certain sodium to blood ratios. Eventually, Garnett's doctor recommended that he be hooked up to an EEG machine. That way they could look for any abnormalities in his brain function that may help explain his seizures. This EEG machine was complete with audio and video equipment. That way they could record Garnett while he was hooked up to and being monitored by the machine. After several days of being monitored and not detecting any seizure activity, Lacey was informed that provided he stay stable through the night, they would likely be discharged the next day. It really seemed as though Garnett was out of the woods. He was in good spirits, he was energetic, and he'd been bouncing around on his hospital bed when the doctor had left the room. However, immediately following this conversation, Lacey can be seen via EEG video footage escorting Garnett to the bathroom. The two were out of view of the camera for a few minutes, and when they returned, Garnett's demeanor had shifted dramatically. He was almost instantly ill and can be seen dry heaving and desperately trying to throw up. However, mind you, he could not do so because of the procedure he'd had when he was a baby. Lacey is then seen double-checking Garnett's feeding tube port before she calmly positions the call button within reach on her son's bed. It's as if she knew that in a matter of minutes, she might need it. And less than 10 minutes after they'd been told they'd be going home the next day, Lacey began frantically calling for help in her son's room. Of course, hospital staff rushed in, but they were super confused. How did this boy go from completely fine one minute to tragically ill the next? There were no obvious answers, so they began running a myriad of tests to see if they could possibly explain what was going on. But the results of these tests were all normal, which was very puzzling. Despite their best efforts, doctors just could not medically determine what the hell had just happened. Luckily, though, Garnett seemed to improve over the course of the day. His only real complaint was that he was thirsty, but beyond that, things seemed to have calmed down. But once Lacey was left alone with her son, she can once again be seen via EEG video footage escorting him back to the bathroom. And again, as soon as they emerge, Garnett is immediately sick. He's writhing in pain, he's trying desperately to vomit, and eventually he falls into a seizure. And this time, doctors were not able to reverse his condition. He was quickly placed on life support before doctors made the emergency decision to airlift him to a larger hospital. And as soon as Lacey emerged from the helicopter at the new hospital, she began demanding that doctors check Garnett's sodium levels. This instantly spiked suspicion in Garnett's new doctors. If the doctors at the other hospital didn't know what was going on, then why the hell was this woman so adamant that her son's condition was related to his sodium levels? Nevertheless, they did run blood work, which included checking his sodium levels, and just as Lacey had known, because she was the one responsible for them, Garnett's sodium levels were absolutely through the roof. They were so high, in fact, that doctors were sure that there was no possible medical explanation, that levels like that would have had to have been caused by some sort of outside factor. This led Garnett's doctor to forbid anyone from administering anything to him by mouth. He could have no food or water because at this point, something as small as a sip of water could affect his sodium levels, cause his brain to swell, and be fatal. And over the next few days with these restrictions, Garnett's condition seemed to improve. He started waking up and breathing independently and really seemed like he was through the worst of it. However, Lacey's social media diary was still painting a really bleak picture of her son's prognosis. Honestly, at this point, she was just spouting off whatever bullshit she could think of to keep people hooked into her story. She refused to let go of this story she concocted, and she refused to let go of the attention she was receiving from the illness she'd created in her son. And at 7:15 a.m. on January 21st, a code blue was called from Garnett's room. When the doctor rushed in, he found Lacey standing over Garnett, sobbing, and from there, he noticed a water bottle under Garnett's bed. He immediately ordered Lacey out of the room, and he ordered a nurse to preserve the bottle. He began examining Garnett, and he could tell right away that his brain was swelling. His pupils were no longer responding, and he was rushed in for a CAT scan. The results of this scan determined that Garnett had, in fact, suffered from irreversible brain damage. He was declared brain dead the same day. However, he was not removed from life support until 10:20 a.m. on January 23rd, 2014. This poor little boy endured years of torture at the hands of the one person who was supposed to protect him the most. And for what? A few likes and follows? I mean, what the fuck? How someone could do that to their own child is incomprehensible to me. Garnett's doctor informed Lacey that he would be reporting Garnett's death to CPS because there was just no way that Garnett's sodium levels had reached the point that they did without some sort of outside intervention. It was not, quote, metabolically possible, unquote. Once police were involved, Lacey did the one thing that she did best. She lied. She sat and looked them dead in the eyes and told them all about Garnett's tragic medical history, and even spoke to them about Garnett's father Blake's recent death. At first, detectives recall having no real reason to question the things that Lacey was telling them. As far as they knew, she was just a mother processing and grieving the loss of her son. However, when detectives spoke to Lacey's father, that's when things started to unravel. When the detective introduced himself to Lacey's father, Terry, he politely offered his condolences on not just the passing of Garnett, but also the passing of Blake. And confused, Terry looked at the detective and said, "Who's Blake?" And right in that very moment, Detective Carfey realized that this woman could not only lie easily, but she could lie well. From there, Lacey's facade fell away, and police quickly discovered what type of monster they were truly dealing with. A warrant was quickly obtained and a search was executed on Lacey's apartment, where police recovered 170 pieces of evidence they believed could be used in a case against Lacey, including, but very much not limited to, a large bottle of salt found on a table next to Garnett's feeding machine. And as if that all wasn't enough, police also received a phone call from a friend of Lacey's whom Lacey had asked to go into her apartment, retrieve, and dispose of a bag of feeding tube supplies. Thankfully, much like the neighbor in the Teresa Jolyn Ritchie case, this friend felt incredibly weird about what she'd been asked to do. So she saved the bag and turned it over to police. And these feeding tube supplies were later determined to be tainted with outrageous levels of salt. Lacey was arrested and charged with murder. Her trial lasted for 2 weeks, and on March 2nd, 2015, a jury found 27-year-old Lacey Spears guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years to life and is currently incarcerated at Bedford Hills Prison for Women. And devastatingly, that wraps up our story for today. I cannot even begin to imagine the pain that this poor little boy endured in just 5 short years of life. The prosecutor in Lacey's case made mention during her trial that Garnett deserved a chance to grow up and that she was a monster for robbing him of that chance. And honestly, I couldn't say it better myself. She is a terrible person. She is the one who is sick, And in my opinion, she is sitting right where she belongs. Let me know what you guys think of this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime or creepy history content each week, and I would love to catch you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.